I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation brought to you by the Society of Decision Professionals, which is entitled Decision Points in the Healthcare Startup Ecosphere. And I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Julia Varshavsky. Leaning on her 20 years of pharmaceutical industry experience, Julia works with life sciences and healthcare startups, aiding with formation of product development plans and coaching on a broad range of topics, including indication-specific product development. As a member of investment groups, she conducts due diligence to help guide investment decisions in transformative healthcare technologies and medicines. Julia, thank you so much for joining us as a moderator today.
Thank you, Eva. Well, it is my distinct pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel, which includes founders, funders, and mentors of pharma and medical device startups. Representation from company founders includes both funders that lead or led companies with products on the market, as well as founders with products at the concept stage, evolution of the product lifecycle. I'm going to start by introducing Rob Neville. Rob is currently a managing partner of Springbok Ventures, a boutique evergreen fund investing in startups. Rob has also been a pharma startup founder himself. In fact, his track record includes being the founder and CEO of Savara Pharmaceuticals, which was NASDAQ listed in 2017. Rob has over 30 years of experience in private, public, and nonprofit sectors, where he led companies in life sciences, software, healthcare IT, and venture capital. Most recently, in yet another exciting twist of his career, Rob has become the president and CEO of Goodwill of Central Texas. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Jean. So this is the point at which I should go through my presentation, is that correct?
No, actually, let me go and introduce everybody else and then you can jump in.
Okay, thank you, and pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So next, I would like to introduce Carole Spangler Vaughn. Carole has spent over 25 years in the life sciences startup ecosystem and is now the founder and CEO of Eisana Corporation. Eisana is developing products and services to prevent devastating side effects of cancer treatments. It is collaborating with academic institutions to design and build a product prototype while embarking on market research for product positioning. They are a pre-seed stage company. Welcome, Carole. Jean-Ann Booth. After selling her previous semiconductor startups to Texas Instruments and Apple, Jean-Ann started her fourth startup for and with her mom. Today, Unaliwear's Kanega watch is the only wristwatch that automatically detects falls in the United States, and it is connected to medical alarm and call centers. The company is in the post-marketing product expansion stage and is trying to figure out how to scale. Welcome, Jean-Ann. And finally, on to Sheila Babnis. Sheila is a pioneer, a trend spotter, and a change agent who uses her business wisdom to prepare individuals, teams, and organizations for future realities. She brings with her 25 years of experience in business transformation and innovation across companies in US and Europe, working with healthcare and consumer product organizations such as Roche, Genentech, Pfizer, and Park Davis. Welcome, Sheila. All right, well, so here we are with the Society of Decision Professionals. And what decision professionals are great at are designing and implementing decision frameworks. So to set the context for this conversation and discussion, I'm going to ask each panelist to say a few more words about their backgrounds and their company products, if applicable, and from that vantage point to reflect on the decision points in the startup ecosphere for medical device and pharmaceutical products. What sort of trends do they see that pharma and medical device space companies are facing right now when walking the path from conceptualization to commercialization of their products? And I'm going to actually start by calling on Jean-Ann and Unaliwear.
Thanks so much, Julia, and thank you to those of you who are here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. and to talk to you about some of these key decisions in doing a startup. As Julia said before, this is actually my fourth startup. Two semiconductor startups exited, and then way in the early age, one failed, which is a lesson that is great. And then Unaliwear is the fourth. Unaliwear we started in 2013, and like I said before, I started at 4 and with my mom. So here's my mom. She's gone now, but she was our senior user experience advisor. And as you can see from the picture, mom was a model. So when she turned 80, she got a little frail. She was totally cognitively capable, but she needed just a little bit more support. And the products on the market are, stigmatizing. Sorry, they are, and mostly ugly. And so my mom, the model, would not wear them, just absolutely wouldn't. And so, we had conversations that led to the creation of Unaliwear back in 2013. So we're 9 years, almost 10 years old now. And so along that way, along that road, there were a couple of really key points for making decisions about this startup. And so first for me was, we were going into healthcare, and my background was 30 years in semiconductors. So I knew nothing about healthcare, capitated models, providers and payers and all of that stuff, So the first thing that I did was I went out and found an accelerator that specialized in digital health and digital health startups. And the time that I did that was South by Southwest 2014. And at that time, there were lots of accelerators. There's a few less of them today for some of the gap reasons that we'll talk about. But we had picked Startup Health, and I'm quite glad that I did that, because now I do understand that capitated models does not mean we cut your head off, which is what I thought the first time I heard that phrase. So, one of the first ones, especially for a company like Unaliwear and the Kanega watch. Oh, wait a minute. Let me tell you about the Kanega watch. So rather than doing a slide, I thought I'd let you actually see a Kanega watch in real life and actually hear it. So Unali is Cherokee for friend. Kanega, the name of the watch, is Cherokee for speak. So we're the friend who speaks to you. Fred Astaire, get help.
I think I heard you ask for help. I am contacting the operator. Press the crown button once if you do not need help, and I will cancel the call.
That's how we work. So in having a product like this, first of all, everybody, has this idea. Oh, I'm going to make a smartwatch for grandma, or an Apple Watch for seniors, or wearable OnStar for people. But you have to actually be able to execute on that. And so some of the fundamentals, one of the first ones was in understanding the healthcare ecosystem and understanding the role of the FDA. We'll come back to this, I think, a little bit later, but I made specific design choices in the feature set of the Kanega watch to make sure that we remained Class 2 emergency services statutory exempt, which greatly reduced the risks for my investors, because we weren't driving a product that nobody had ever built before through the FDA process as a little teeny weeny startup and with absolutely no inroads in the FDA at all.
Actually, Jeanette, if I could ask you, I don't know that everybody is familiar with Class 2 versus Class 3, and maybe if you could dive into it for just a minute so that the audience understand what you just said there.
Oh, okay, sure. So I'm an electrical engineer.
I know it's hard,
not an FDA specialist. So I'm going to give you my simple way of looking at things, and I kind of have a simple brain. So Class 2 means you're getting data that somebody else is going to make a decision about. Class 3 means you're making a decision without the doctor. That's my way of looking at it. So when it comes to something like a Kanega watch, we actually go direct to dispatch. We bypass 911. We do that through medical alarm call centers. And that's really important. That's a key part of what we do, because most of our demographic has multiple key comorbidities. And so in doing that, then by bypassing 911, that makes us class 2 emergency services. If I add any physical biometrics whatsoever, then, heart rate monitor, blood pressure, hydration sensor, doesn't matter, then we're class 3 because we're cutting the doctor out of the loop of actually saying emergency services might need to be activated here. So that's the big difference. That is, hugely the thing that most consumers do not understand at all. And it took me a long time to figure it out too.
It
So
makes for a much more complicated approval path being a class 3, is it not?
not only is it more complicated, but it's about $15 million. So, so just to give you a scale for what that means, Unaliwear has raised 20 million, sorry. Unaliwear has raised 20 million over the last almost decade, and it would have cost me that again to go class 3. So the problem about the physical biometrics is not it's not an engineering problem. It's possible to create that device. It's actually an FDA problem. So that's key. If you're going to be doing healthcare, you definitely need to make sure that you understand where the FDA sits on your solution. And you also have to understand your funding options, not only your early funding options, but also your later funding options. It never occurred to me that we could prove product market fit and still have challenges actually getting funding because our VCs are pretty stratified. Healthcare VCs are all about reimbursement. Well, we're actually a private pay product, which means generally insurance doesn't pay for a Kanega watch. Okay. And so no reimbursement, no healthcare VCs. But the consumer VCs go, oh, it's a healthcare product because you're class 2, right? So it's made for a very interesting and challenging, frankly, funding environment. I raised over $100 million for my semiconductor companies, and the 20 million I raised here took, 9 years. So you can imagine that that's quite challenging. And so I think I'm gonna stop there and let us go on to the rest of our discussion. But there are definitely really big decisions that you need to be looking at, especially if you're going to be doing a healthcare product, because they take longer.
Yeah, no, thank you for that summary, Jeanette. And I think you hit on a couple of really key, particulars of the space. And that was you needed to figure out how to find a mentor first. You were coming from a background where you weren't an expert in the space. So that's really key to set yourself up for success. Then the complexity of the regulatory environment, and I'm sure you learned a ton there. Operating in regulated space is very different than operating in any other space. And a lot of decisions that need to be made within. It sounded like you made the right decision sticking with class 2, but I'm sure it wasn't. You had to do a lot of exploring around then and a lot of benchmarking and understanding what that means. And funding, obviously, and that impacted your funding strategy and product market fit strategy. All of those things there are a lot of decisions that are being made, that need to be made along those streams. So anyway, thank you for that summary, and we're going to move on and contrast it with Carole's company, Eisana, who is in the pre-seed stage right now and conceptualization stage. Carole, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Julia. Great to be here. This is a subject that I am personally fascinated by, so I'm really excited to offer some contributions to the discussions. So I have a PhD in biophysics from Johns Hopkins and an MBA from the University of Washington. And as Julia mentioned in my introduction, I've spent over 25 years in the life science ecosystem. I started out at Bristol Myers Squibb, and after 5 years there, I really thought I was more in line with the startup community, which is where I've been ever since. So interestingly enough, most of the companies I've worked with have brought cancer products to market. And I sort of felt like I was an expert in cancer until I became a patient in 2017. And what I learned is the patient experience is very different. Everybody's very focused on survival. and not so much about side effects. And if you look at the stats, there's 18 million cancer survivors in the US as of today. That's a big number. That's expected to grow as treatments get better and better. And I think before I was a patient, I thought, gosh, you get cancer, you go through treatment, and then life goes back to normal. And that is just absolutely not true. And I think people realize that, in the quote I put here is that treatments that extend survival come with a cost. And pretty much there's an expectation that you just, close your mouth and put a smile on your face and accept the side effects. And I think everybody knows about the short-term side effects, nausea, anemia, infection, mouth sores, hair loss, fatigue. But what people don't talk so much about are the long-term side effects that impact your quality of life. Statistics say it increases your healthcare costs going forward. And so in talking with patients and nurses and oncologists, the biggest pain point is nerve damage in your hands and feet, or peripheral neuropathy. And, the reasons, the drug goes into your bloodstream and it goes out to your fingers and toes and actually destroys those sensitive nerve endings. And this can leave patients permanently disabled. And the trick for the oncologist is figuring out what to do if, say, you're having 12 rounds of Taxol for breast cancer, and at week 8, you start showing nerve damage. The oncologist, without any guidelines, has to figure out the best path forward. Do you stop treatment? Reduce treatment, which impacts survival? Do you keep going? And then maybe the patient won't be able to work at the end of treatment. So it's a big problem. And interestingly enough, there are several studies that show that something as simple as cooling your hands and feet can prevent this nerve damage. And you can think about that. If you cool your hands and feet, you'll constrict the blood vessels. And that's very effective. So when I went through treatment, I figured there'd be a great patient-centric device to do this, and I was incorrect. I used baggies of frozen corn for my hands and my feet, which is a far cry from, I know the smart engineers in this country can build. So we are designing, still working on a prototype, an innovative patient-friendly approach to preventing chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. We're using thermoelectric cooling, which is small and lightweight. Patients need to be able to cool for hours. As you can imagine, after they unplug your infusion port, you still have a very high level of drug in your bloodstream, so you need to cool for several hours later to get that to a safe level, which means you need to be able to take the device home and finish cooling. So that's what we're working on. And then, Julia's question about what are the pivotal decisions facing a pre-seed founder, and, it's capital, capital, capital. And, the reason is that the stats are that pre-seed funding is very hard to get, because a lot of times you're going to investors with an idea and a team, and maybe not even so much of a team. So being able to get capital drives absolutely everything. So, you need to have your strategy that will attract investors, and investors at the early stage have preconceived notions of what valuation should be and what development costs should be. So you have to make your strategy fit into what's expected to get the early stage money. So because it's such high risk. The other thing is capital determines your strategy. If you have a little bit of capital, you may have to build something in your garage. If you have a little more, you may be able to leverage some university. If you have a good bit, you may be able to go straight to a commercial development firm. But again, it all depends on how much money you're able to raise. Capital determines your team. You can't go out and get, the best people at market rates, because you just don't have the capital to do that. So you have to find people that fit your culture, that will accept stock options for a good bit of their compensation. Again, capital impacts your intellectual property strategy. Do you go to a provisional and then convert it a year later? If you convert a year later, what countries do you want to go into? So, depending on your strategy, in our case, our exit, we're planning an acquisition. So we want to make sure that we have a profile of the acquiring company and look at what countries they would like to see us have patent protection in. Every country is a lot more money. So again, the capital determines your IP strategy. And then really, when you get money, how do you allocate that? In life sciences, it's so complicated. We have reimbursement, we have regulatory, I mentioned IP, marketing, competitive analyses. So you have a stated amount of money, and how do you allocate that in the best way to optimize your final decision on where you're going? And then the last thing I'll mention is every startup company that I know of has had to make at least one pivot, right? You start with a great idea, you raise your money, and then you bump into some walls. So, what are your choices for getting around and pivoting to a new strategy? And again, that's going to depend on how much capital you've got left in the bank. So, the pivotal decisions, and you think about the job of a pre-seed founder. If capital was unlimited, this would be a really easy job. But the fact of the matter is it's not. So you have to, figure out, given what you've got, how do you make the best decisions to get the best outcome going forward?
Thank you very much, Carole, for that summary and for everything you're doing for the cancer patient community. A really remarkable mission. Thank you. And thank you for also hitting on some of the conundrums that founders face. You said capital, capital, capital. And so, I find that, founders are finding themselves in this space where they basically just have to raise money all the time, and they don't have time to develop the product. And yet the product strategy and product development so much impact so much how you raise capital. And like you said, it's sort of a circle. So breaking that down and figuring out where are the key decision points, and building the target product profile, and then thinking about commercialization strategy. It kind of all has to fit together, and the founder needs to figure out in which sequence, to approach this. And it's usually an iterative strategy, and the stakes are so high if you go in the wrong direction. So we're going to jump into that further in the panel, but thank you for setting this up for us. So we're now going to move on to Rob and his perspective as a mentor, as a funder, as a founder on the space.
Thank you, Julia, and good morning, everyone. I couldn't agree more with Carole that money is such a key part of this. Let me quickly give you some background. I've done a few startups. The most recent one was Evity, and that one sold and gave a nice return. We raised 1.5 million in one seed round, so it made it easier there because we had enough money to do what we needed, and we actually only needed one round to exit. The next company, Savara, which was biotech versus IT of Evity, raised $50 million from 400 angels, and then went on to raise 250, and the company was listed on NASDAQ. And then I started Springbok Ventures, and we do early stage investing across quite a broad spectrum of healthcare, medical devices, therapeutics. And then while I'm doing Springbok Ventures, I've also just accepted a job at Goodwill as the CEO and president of Goodwill in Central Texas. So I have a very interesting broad perspective from multiple industries, starting companies, also from the venture side, and now the nonprofit. And really pivotal decisions to me, the way I see startups, having run them and also invested in them, launching a startup is like throwing yourself off a cliff and assembling the aircraft on the way down. And you want to get it right before you hit the ground. Another way of saying the same quote is that there's no elevator to success in the startup world. Really, it's a stairwell. And every day you have to make decisions to climb the next flight of stairs. And it just seems like it keeps going on forever. And you need money to get to the next flight of stairs. And so what do you need to focus on from a decision standpoint? There's a very strong parallel between the decisions and also what we look at when we're doing diligence investing into companies. And the way I like to do that is look at why do the startups hit the ground? What do they do wrong and fail? And there's so much data out there showing, I won't go through all this, but there's a lot of data about why startups fail. This is just one of the sources of that data. And really you can lump that into three categories that cover about 90% of the reasons why startups fail. The primary one, and that's what Carole was just talking about, is money. Not just raising the money, but using it wisely once you've got it. The second category is product market fit. And that, that is, making sure that the product you ultimately develop will have a market and that you're not going to get outcompeted. And the third reason why startups hit the ground is team. burnout and lack of passion, disharmony, and the like. So in each of these categories, I'm going to give you just a few thoughts. I mean, I don't have a lot of time. I could literally do a talk on each of these. But the first one, and that's capitalization. Carole and others were talking about someone. It's the oxygen of your business. And there's two aspects, obviously, how to raise it. And CEOs, as we're investing in companies, as as well as when I'm mentoring CEOs, you have to be a good storyteller. You've got to motivate people, especially early stage, pre-seed, seed, but even, it doesn't matter, even as you get to series A, B, C, you're talking to people that have a heart. You've got to compel them to invest in your company. You've got to tell a good story. And you've got to have all the right artifacts. You've got to have all the right pieces of information. I need executive summaries and business plans and market research and all the right stuff in place. And then the other question, and this is a big one, is how do you spend it? So when you've got money, you never get as much as you want. You just don't. And so are you addressing the risks early enough? So what are the key risks and how can you address them early enough? And then add value enough. So you get some money, let's just say $500,000 in your pre-seed. What's the best thing we can do with that to just get far enough so that we can then tell another story that's a little bit more compelling and get a little bit more money? One way to solve that problem is to actually just ask people further down the road, where do we need to be so that one day you'll be interested in us and you can get some sense of that. So the second reason why startups hit the ground, as I said, is product market fit. And I like this quote, don't find customers for your products, find products for your customers. And there's so many decision points along the way, figuring out whether your product is the right thing. And you've probably heard of TAM, SAM, and SOM. It's total addressable market, serviceable addressable market, serviceable obtainable market. These are all just sizings. How many people are worldwide that could possibly buy this? And how many people can you target with in the SAM that are realistic for your marketing and go-to-market strategy? SOM is, what are we going to do in the next 5 years? And is that feasible? And there's a lot of decisions about who you're going to actually target. And then the question is, can you validate any of these assumptions early? Sometimes you can. Sometimes you don't even have to have a product yet. You can go and do market surveys, or you can have a very rough prototype and you can actually go and show that around. And ultimately, what you want to do for most companies and products is calculate the cost of client acquisition and lifetime value and do math to say, oh yeah, if we do get this to market, we actually have something, we can spend less money on the marketing than we will actually get in customer revenue. And then the last one on how to prevent a startup hitting the ground is really getting the right team. And everybody mentions this. I love this quote. If you can get all the people in an organization rowing in the same direction, you can dominate any industry in any market against any competition at any time. And it's so hard because early on you don't have the money to get the right people. And you've got to, again, be a good storyteller and motivate people with equity. And that was mentioned earlier. The other thing I've noticed is that there's often hotspots. You have people that look good, and I've had an individual, one of my teams, that was technically so capable that I depended on him, but he was a cancer, and I had to remove him ultimately. But you've got founders that shouldn't be the CEOs, and how do you navigate that? And you've got to take care of these hotspots quickly. And then the last point on this is as you're starting a company and as you're trying to figure out how to do all this, how do you get mentors? You need people to help you figure out how to raise money. Where do you go? What kind of story do you need to tell? How do you run your company? What kind of board do you need to put together? On the development side, there's so many choices, just like Jean Ann was mentioning earlier, about what angle do we go in? How do we really navigate the development path, and where do we put our efforts? There's so many different decision points, but getting mentors along the way. And I know that Sheila's going to be talking more about that. But that's my quick thoughts on some of the ways I analyze and do my diligence on companies. And it all comes down to, are they making the right decisions at the right time?
Thank you very much, Rob, for that excellent portrayal of the complexities of the space and what matters. And as you mentioned, it's capital, product market fit, and teams, and kind of the rest of it sort of stems out of these three buckets. And absolutely. So thank you. We're going to dive into all of that in further in the panel. And now I'd like to pass it on to Sheila Babnis, who is coming largely from mentorship and coach perspective. And so Sheila, please take it away, introduce yourself a little bit more, and then tell us what you think are the key decision points in the Ecosphere that you're seeing.
Yeah, so happy to be here. This is really kind of a fun and exciting topic, and there is so much going on in the industry right now. So I really, I kind of come at it from a different perspective. I've worked in both biotech and pharma for quite a long time, both in running portfolios in the clinical trial space, as well as introducing new technologies, digital innovation into how we run clinical trials today. And it's a really interesting space. Not only that, but I think one of the things that I've learned from working in that area, particularly in the innovation management group that I ran, is you can't do it alone. You need an ecosphere around you. And that ecosphere is kind of not just the business that you're in, but it's the people around you that you're going to either service, work with, or are working for. And really finding spaces where you can start to have that user conversation. And I think both Carole and Jean-Anne talked about that. I don't think it's ever too early to start to think about that piece, because at the end of the day, we're building products for patients, for customers. The other thing that I want to share is that not only have I worked in the pharma space, but I've also worked for startups in the contract research arena and put new departments together and new business units together for them. And they have a different way of looking at things. And I've also worked for Change Healthcare that does digital applications and large mainframe health systems work. And I think today, healthcare is so interconnected. The more you can start to bring in kind of smaller pieces of conversation around what are these different groups looking for, the better off you're going to be. I mean, you definitely need to know what the VCs want as you're getting the funding and money, but let's assume you've got some of the money. Once you've got the money, what are the things that you really need to be thinking about? So that's one arena. The other thing that I'm seeing right now from a trend perspective, and I think this is very interesting, is rapid prototyping and testing. I work with a small startup here in St. George, Utah, which is where I live right now. And they are actually out in the market, already testing, already getting data and evidence back within the first year of their startup. So I'm finding that VCs are really looking for returns as early as possible, with evidence as early as possible, which is different than maybe even 3 to 5 years ago, which I think is very interesting for us to be aware of. And then the last thing that I want to bring in, because I think everybody else has kind of brought the top major things, which is the capital, the people, and the risk mitigation piece, is as founders, it's really important to understand what your network is, not only just what your network is, but what is your team's network of people out there. And I think a lot of people assume when they come into their role that the network that they have is going to be sufficient. And what I would encourage you to think about is the networks that you have right now aren't necessarily the networks and the connections that you need for what you're trying to do. And so how do you start to mitigate not having a sufficient network out there so that you can bring the right people into your circle?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's enough for me.
Well, thank you, Sheila. And can I just follow up just a little bit to contextualize it for us a little bit further? So you said, okay, so now let's say you've got money. Now what? Have you thought more about how to kind of go about that piece in terms of framework in it? I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I was just curious or should we talk about this later? Or can you say just a few words right now?
Yeah, so I am a huge proponent of decision-making science. And so I think it's really kind of stepping back and saying, what are those key elements that we need to consider that are important to us, and actually weight how important those decisions are, because those elements are going to drive the choices that you're going to make further down the road. and being really clear about those things. You know, I think Rob talked a little bit about the values and the people piece. Like, if you don't have the values and the people piece right, and that doesn't mean hires, that means I can contract them in, I can bring advisors, I can have mentors. There's a variety of different ways that you can get those competencies and capabilities, but they need to be with the right people, because the wrong people can totally destroy your business. But the thing for me is really think about what are those key elements that are going to be important in this kind of next year to 18 months, and how do I want to structure and how do I want to weight those elements, so that when I go back to my decision making, I'm constantly bringing myself back to kind of my North Star.
Mhm. So true. And I find that myself as well, that, you know, kind of having the discipline of mapping the path, even it probably will be the wrong path because you're learning along the, you know, walking the path all the time, but just having that discipline to map it out and map out the target product profile and kind of having that, you know, discipline really goes a long way. And the capital, lack of capital, it's, you think you're a small startup and you don't have money, but large corporations, you have to be accountable for the capital that you have as well. So they do have those frameworks in place that help along the way. But the difference, I think, is for the ecosphere of startups is that if you take the wrong turn, you may be done. And the luxury that bigger corporations have, okay, you can borrow capital from another team or another pocket, and there are so many other indications and products to support you. So the failure to make the right decision in the startup ecosphere is so much more critical. And having the right mindset and framework is absolutely pivotal for success. Well,
and
yeah.
don't forget the network piece, because I think that, you know, your primary network when you start is not going to be the network that you're going to end up with, which means you got to get out and talk to different people.
Right. People are your strength for sure. So we're going to dive into that some more further on, but now I want to kick it back to Carole and Jean-Ann and talk about one or two examples from their experience with their current company, or you can borrow from companies that you have started before. What are the key successes along those decision lines that you're proud of in terms of decision making? And what are the decisions that you're not so proud of? And what could you have done differently? And that would help us generalize, you know, to overall space. But if you could maybe give us a few specific examples, that would be wonderful. So maybe one example each, one great decision, one not so great decision. So we'll start with Jean-Ann.
Okay. So goodness gracious, one not so great decision. I'm going to start with that one. So I think, you know, Rob gave you guys a quote from Seth Godin. He also wrote a book called The Dip. And it's a great book. It talks about how do you know when you quit? And, you know, everybody will tell you that being an entrepreneur is seriously hard, and it is seriously hard. And one of the hardest challenges is the one that says, when you're having a hard time making this happen, assembling that aircraft on the way down, you know, is it because you're doing the wrong thing? Or is it just hard, right? And so Seth has a book called The Dip that talks about, you know, it's really short. It talks about how do you decide when it is time to quit or not to quit. And I can't even count over the last 9 years the number of very respected business people who've told me that what we were doing was simply too hard to be done in today's environment, and I should stop. But my best friend taught me something a long time ago, which is a very important learning, and that is, you know when it's time to give up when you are out of paths to go down. And so when you look at it from a decision-making perspective, you've got all of these different paths that you can execute on. And, like Rob said, when the founders give up, they, a burnout or something along those lines, it's because they're not looking ahead at all of those other paths that they have to go down and just saying, I'm gonna do it. And so, it's kind of not a failure as much, like we didn't do it wrong, but I certainly did in the past 9 years spend multiple times of going back and going, it shouldn't be this hard to raise this much money in a market with 60 million people in the United States and over 1 billion worldwide. It shouldn't be this hard. So I have to be doing something wrong. And it turns out I wasn't. But that was a key thing. One other one that I want to mention.
Sorry, when you say quit, there are many quits along the product development paths too, right? Sort of go, no go decision where you decide, okay, I'm not going to pursue that direction anymore. And then pursue something else. So how do you have you experienced that? I know you and I have, you shared previously an example of where you maybe chose a wrong material for your watch. And that was, you realized that was wrong. And so could you speak a little bit more, maybe more specifically about this or some other decision like that where you just.
Sure. So when I was talking about quit a minute ago, I actually meant, rule number 1, never run out of money. And so if you're running out of money, then the question you're asking yourself all the time is, do I need to quit? And the answer is, are you out of paths to go down? Talking about this learning, it's definitely a learning, but I don't really necessarily think of it as a failure, because what we did with the Kanega watch, there is not a product like it in the entire world. Nothing like a Kanega watch in the entire world. And so I knew we were breaking ground that nobody else had broken before. So the first generation Kanega watch, I just happen to have with me right here. Look at this lovely piece of phenomenally stellar, strong engineering. It's stainless steel, medical grade, weighs 1/4 pound. Don't know how many older people but my mom was 93 pounds when she passed. 1/4 pound is a lot of weight. And so I knew we were going to have things to learn. And I went ahead and took this version of the Kanega watch to market in 2017. Taking that time to learn what we needed to learn. It was also 3G cellular, so I knew I was going to have to make a change pretty soon. But I wanted to get that learning, and the learning was that's too big and too heavy. So here's a Kanega watch today. You see that difference? So the Kanega watch is the weight and thickness of an Apple Watch, but all of the patented goodness that only a Kanega watch can provide. So, I intentionally, I got some flack from an observer on my board about taking this one to market because I was pretty sure it wasn't going to stick. And I was right. 2/3 of what we sold came back within the first month because it weighed too much. But you've gone far enough down the path that it's actually cheaper to take it to market and learn those lessons that you're going to have to learn anyway, than to make an assumption, especially in a space nobody's ever done before, and assume incorrectly. So that's what we did there.
This is so fascinating on so many levels because, one is, inspiration, right? You did something wrong and it's not taking off, and you have to find the strength within yourself to start it over again and see it as a progression rather than the end of the road. And it constantly amazes me how founders find that strength within them and their courage and their inspiration. I constantly draw from it. And the other one, I guess, my curiosity around this, if you had to do it over again, having learned this lesson, would you have done something differently? Maybe more market research, or like maybe you skipped that bit, or you didn't ask the question about the material. Like, what would you, if you were to build another product in the space, what would you do to prevent yourself from like taking it all the way to market and having to learn from there?
See, that was why when you were asking for failures, I didn't list this as a failure, because If you look at what we did, I mean, we did focus groups with over 400 people across the US. My mom was personally responsible for the first 100 folks who came through. So we did a ton of market research. We had a beta program of over 100 people before I went to market. But see, the beta program is free. Customers, when we went to market, paid for it. And so really, since there was nothing like what we do, still isn't anything like what we do, there wasn't, at some point you have to actually test it in the market. Do you have it right, and are people going to pay for it? That's why, you know, that Rob talked about the three things, right? It's capital, it's product market fit, and it's team. And you know, sometimes product market fit, the only way to test it is to actually go to market.
Very good point. And makes that space very tough. Yeah, and money matters.
So can I tell you one thing that I am happy with that we did?
Yes, yes.
Other than
I know you're in the market, so there were a lot of things you did right.
So one of the things that I did early on, when we got our very first funding, I started doing a monthly investor report. And so now for, let's see, we got our first funding in September of 2014. So however many years that is, I've been doing a monthly report for all of our investors. It's a one-pager on the business, full financials, and then once we were in market, you know, key metrics of sales and marketing. That has been so worth it. I got a lot of feedback from people going, a month is too frequently, but in a startup's world, a month, a lot changes. And in the end, you know, that ability to speak to my investor base every single month and to provide my thoughts, my input, my feedback, was the thing that allowed us to actually get to where we're going. So Rob talked about having 400 investors. Unaliwear is primarily angel backed as well. We've got 190 entities on our cap table. And that radical transparency that I did in those monthly investor reports allowed the investors to continue to actually develop a relationship with me and to trust, so that within the last couple of months, we actually closed the last funding that we should need to go to exit. And it was an inside round. It was completely my investors getting together and going, we're tired of having her waste time from their perspective, fundraising. We want her to focus on scaling. So let's just put it together. And they did. So, you know, the you know, wisdom that everybody would usually have is a monthly report isn't worth the time. And I definitely beg to differ, especially if you've got angels in your startup funding group.
You're such a great point, and I think it kind of ties together with what Sheila was saying earlier, and Rob, about network building and the team building, and keeping you know, your supporters, your funders, and broader networks aware of what you're doing, how you're doing it, not just your successes, but your failures, your struggles, but like in a constructive way. You know, builds that community for you that they're willing to shoulder you up when the time comes. It's just such a great point, and I've seen it mentioned in a number of books as well. So thank you for sharing that, Gina. Really excited about your product. I can't get.
Hey, Julie, can I say one thing about that? Because I think that's
Yeah,
really interesting.
Please,
Because I think the metrics, or the investor report, and the metrics that you put together connect back to the goals of the company, which then theoretically should connect back to the framework of what your decision table priorities are for the company at that time period. And the communication is such a critical part. And I think a lot of people forget that ongoing communication has a huge impact, whether it's the investor community or back to the people or wherever. So I think that's a great example, Jeanne.
And there were two outcomes of that. The first was, you can actually go back and see in our investor reports, when we did our major pivot, we were originally going to go B2B to C through the traditional market for medical alerts, which is the wholesale monitoring centers and their independent dealer networks. And we're just too different. It didn't work. That was one of the other tests. And when we had the stainless steel quarter-pound watch. And so we pivoted to direct to consumer. And the other thing is the advantage, if you do something like that, especially if you have a larger network of angels like I do, I have an angel who is a specialist in everything I need. And so all I need to do is to let them know what I need. And I can't even think of how many times that we have been almost running out of business, because, you know, startups only live in 2 states, right? You're either struggling or you're out of business, right? So how many times that we have been struggling, and, you know, I send out my monthly report, here's the challenges that we're facing. And, you know, one of my investors calls me up and says, you know, Jean-Ann, you need to, and I'm like, ah, I'm just too close to the business to see it, but they do. And they'll make the connections, they make the relationships, we keep going. And, you know, 9 years later, almost 10, here we are.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess on that point, Rob, do you want to chime in maybe too? I know that Springbok, as many great VC firms, also coaches and mentors their startups. And so do you have a comment on this last point that Jean-Ann made?
I mean, I know Jean-Ann well, and her and I were raising money actually when I was running Springbok at the same time. And, you know, the network effect that Sheila spoke about is just so critical. You know, it's just such a challenge. I mean, decision making is so, and this is exactly what Carole said earlier, it's just so directly tied to what you have and how much money you have. And what Jean-Ann said earlier, the pivots that you need to do is you learn as you go to market with something and you learn something, you have to have the resources to be able to you know, reinvent yourself and move in a different direction. You know, there's so many wealthy people out there that want to invest in startups though. And so it's just a matter to me of figuring out who's out there, how do you find them, and how do you tell the right story that you're going to be able to, that's going to resonate with these audiences. And like most startups, you start out telling a story and you learn a little bit about it and you get a few investors and you make progress with that money, and your investors get confidence that you know what you're doing, and then they tell their friends, and then you go raise another round of money with a slightly better story, and then you slowly build out that investor base, and each of them keep introducing you to folks. So really, it is a massive network effect. The struggle comes in when you make a misstep. So you raise money to reach a certain milestone that you said you could meet, and then you get obstacles in your way. For instance, you know, in a regulatory environment, you weren't anticipating some other study you needed to do that you now need to do that you didn't have to do, and then you've got to get more money, and yet you haven't reached any inflection. Those are the challenging points. So what do you do now? But hopefully that's, you know, if you can run a company and not come across those situations, my hat off to you. I've never been able to do it.
Thank you, Rob. All right, we're gonna, Carole, call on you, and could you speak about your, you know, moments that you're proud of and not so proud of, and give us a few examples.
Yeah, I love Jean-Ann's comments. So there's sort of 2 things I want to draft off about having really quality people on your cap table. And I've been a CEO before, I've worked with CEOs, and I know just how horrible it can be to have challenging people on your cap table. It sucks the life out of you, and you don't have a lot of life left after you're running a startup. So I was very deliberate about who I wanted on my cap table. The other comment that Jean-Ann alluded to was there are lots of discouragers out there. So I really wanted people that would support a female founder. Female founders only get 2% of the capital raised. So it's a different journey. It's a more difficult journey. So I wanted to make sure that the values of the people on my cap table supported that, and they were excited about that. People told me that I should just take money from anyone who wants to give it to me, and I didn't like that advice. And I can tell you that I actually oversubscribed my pre-seed round, all with strategic people. And as Jean Ann said, it's wonderful to be able to, have a question and go straight to an investor who's had experience, who's walked down the pathway before, and then get some advice back from them. So that was a good decision. And I'll sort of tack onto that about, sort of the different pathway for female founders. I decided to get resources specifically for female founders because obviously, if you're a female founder and you're trying to raise money the way the guys do it, we're not doing very well. We're only ending up with 2%. So really surrounding myself with an ecosystem of people that support female founders that walk you through, what are your strengths and use those instead of just doing it sort of the old-fashioned way. I'll put a shout out to Springbok Enterprises, which is how I met Julia, a phenomenal organization. And then the mentors I got from that program helped me make really good decisions. One of the better decisions is do independent quantitative market research early. So you can really talk about, so you really have a good understanding. And I see founders who say, well, I surveyed a bunch of my friends. And I'm like, well, that's not so great, right? You need to work with an independent market research team who will screen people so you're actually getting valuable data from different sets of people in different locations, right, with different experiences. So that was a good decision. And that sort of feeds into a pivot that we made very early on. So when I went through my cancer journey, there were two side effects that I was mostly worried about. I mentioned the peripheral neuropathy, but also the hair loss. So I still had 2 school-age children at home, and we're a tight family, and it was hard enough for them to watch me go through the cancer journey that I really didn't want them to deal with me showing up at the breakfast table with no hair. So there are ways on the market to cool your scalp, but they're expensive, they're really difficult, they're painful. For the most part, they only work 50% of the time. So I came out of that experience saying, we want to start with a product that solves all the problems of the existing products for patients to save their hair. Interestingly enough, doing the independent market research, I found out that was a really not a great idea. So the nurses and the doctors all said, hair grows back, we're not really concerned about it, and the technologies available are 50% effective, and so we don't even recommend them to our patients. And they said, but what we really care about is the nerve damage, because there isn't a good solution. And one of the oncologists we talked to said, I worry about being sued if I leave a patient unable to work. So definitely, we put the hair loss aside. I think that will be a great product to come down the road, but definitely by launching with the peripheral neuropathy product, there's a clear unmet need. And you can talk to clinics. MD Anderson is where I'm getting treatment. It's in my hometown. They're passing out baggies of ice or bowls of ice water. So imagine, feeling pretty sorry for yourself that you're at an infusion center and then you're putting your hands and feet in bowls of ice water. So not a very happy situation. So definitely there's low-lying fruit there for market adoption, are all these clinics that are trying to help their patients by cooling their hands and feet without patient-centric devices. Oh, and one more quote that I heard, since we're throwing out some quotes. One of my investors said, your dream may die, but never give up on your dream. And that kind of keeps me going. My dream is to make the lives of cancer patients better, and we know how to do that. So that's my dream. So his whole thought was, if that's your dream, don't ever water that down or walk away from that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that story, Carole. And I think it goes right, to some of the concepts we've discussed in the product market fit, and sometimes it's a very emotional choice that people have to make. From the standpoint of a patient, of course, losing the hair is a very emotional choice for a woman. But how does that contrast, and what are the parameters to contrast that against neuropathy, for example? And for a company designing a product, how do you go about making that choice? And these are not easy choices. and you have to spend a lot of time thinking about the product market fit, the ethics of it, liaison with patient community as well as the doctor treatment community. So not easy choices, but founders have to face them and make the right call. And it sounds like you're making the right call. So again, thank you for all the work you're doing, and that's in that very difficult and emotional space. Well, I think this is the time where I would like to transition to some of the generalizations and talk about, from the examples that we've shared and some of the brainstorm and high level thinking that we've shared, transition to identification of the gaps in the space that exists. So we've talked about examples of successes, examples of failures, kind of typical problems facing this space and typical decision points. So could we all now sort of brainstorm towards general gaps that we see in the space, and then we'll finish our discussion with maybe the brainstorm of how those gaps could be closed. In terms of, we're not going to solve, this immense problems and the immense gaps that obviously exist, but just start that conversation with the Society of Decision Professionals in the audience today. And then we're going to turn it on to the audience in the last 10 minutes to ask questions, to answer their questions and to hear their reflections. So I'd like to go back to Rob at this point. And Rob, if you could, I know you've talked about the three big dimensions, which is the capital, the product market fit, and the team. But how do you, this is what the founder should be thinking about. But what are the gaps that exist right now? What makes this three dimensions so difficult to navigate, in your opinion? Because most startups fail, right? So.
Yeah, it's hard to generalize that. I mean, I'm just trying to think so I'm on multiple boards of companies that we've invested in, and I'm trying to think, what are the common themes where, even if you take those three big things aside, the money, the people, and the product market fit, what are the big struggles across all the healthcare companies that I'm on the board? It's so hard to generalize because each CEO and team bring certain expertise to the table, and yet they still have massive areas where they've got blind spots, and they're not always easy. It's not always easy to mentor them and help them close those gaps, especially as a board member. You just have one voice. I'm trying to think of what are the key gaps. I would say resources might be the key one if there was a theme across all the CEOs. So for instance, the CEOs just often don't know. They don't know that they need, when they're starting out a company, that they need a certain policies and procedures, like a handbook. But others would have been in a company and they know you need a handbook ultimately when you're employing people to lay out your policies and procedures. So that's the one that pops to mind. It's just a small thing, but they just don't know, but others do. And then another CEO just doesn't really know how to put together a security. Like, he just doesn't know. By security, I mean the vehicle with which you will raise money against. And there's lots of choices in a security. You can, there's lots of choices and lots of terms, and some of them are quite complex. If you're doing a equity-based financing versus a convertible debt, that's a 150-page document, and they don't have the expertise to know what that needs to look like. And so I would say the common theme, the gaps to me, is just resources, and people don't even know what they don't know. So where do you go for each of these different things? And as a startup, you can't be calling your attorney every time at $800 an hour. But that's just what came to mind, Julia, when you said.
I think this is so pivotal, Rob. Thank you. And let's stay actually on that point for a while. I find this to be quite pivotal as well, that CEO just has to be knowledgeable about everything. Or knowledgeable about the gaps that they have in their training to develop their product. And sometimes they just don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And there are incubators, like Jeanette spoke about the accelerator that she found, that she knew to go after because she didn't have the medical device experience. She was a techie, and these are the kind of products that she took to market before. So are there enough accelerators? Is there enough out there for founders to know how to, where to turn? I feel that there's a gap there. So could you guys reflect? Maybe I'll ask. I'll ask Jeanette. Maybe Jeanette, do you have, like, you seem to have found that right accelerator for you right away? Like, what kind of research have you done? Was it easy to find? What made you choose it? Could you speak a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of founders struggle with that first step even.
Yeah, they totally do. And I think that, I do have some opinions about this. When I did my first semiconductor startup, it was 1997. So, the resources that exist today didn't exist at all then. And, so the things about structure of the deal that Rob was talking about, I learned those by paying our attorney a bunch of money to teach me. And now there's some phenomenal books and things along those lines that you can do. But on the accelerator side, in 2014 during South by Southwest, I interviewed all of the health accelerators. And during that time, that was a big, everybody and their dog had a health accelerator. There was a bunch of them. And of course, they're sitting there thinking that, I'm going to be applying, and they're telling me about how their 3-month program is going to teach me how to build a team and teach me how to, do all of the other fundamental tasks of a CEO. And frankly, that's not what I needed, right? What I needed was somebody who was going to help me with that specialized healthcare knowledge. And knowing that even in the beginning, the only reason I started Unaliwear, actually, I didn't show you our patented battery system in the band. So you never have to take your Kanega watch off to charge. So it's there to help our demographic when they're most vulnerable to falls, mostly in the bathroom at night. So the whole original start was about building a physical product. And so if you've got a 3-month accelerator and a physical product, or a product that requires FDA trials or any of that kind of stuff, you're out of the accelerator and on your own when you need a lot of help. And so, the first reason that I actually joined Startup Health was because they actually built it as an academy. And here, so I joined them in 2014, and I am still an active member of Startup Health today. And had I done one of
Startup Health
programs, it wouldn't have,
What is Startup Health?
It's an accelerator focused on startups going in the healthcare space. They've got 10 moonshots that they kind of look for people to be in. But it's a journey program rather than a 3 months and a demo day program, because 3 months is just one prototype, right, in a physical product. So that was really I think that is one of our limitations. I talked to a lot of newer in their journey founders, and they're looking at this accelerator and that accelerator, and especially if they're doing either a physical product or clinical trials, something that it's gonna be a period of time, and then you get to make major decisions about the business. Those 3-month programs are just really, really hard. And so that makes things really challenging. And I guess I would add that you also have on the accelerator side some of the same challenges that you have on the funding side. And that is, the generalization and the specialization of the groups that you're working with. On the funding side, one of the challenges we run into, or at least that I see, is, so first of all, about every decade, the money sources move up. Okay. And so that means that, some of the more sophisticated angel groups are really acting more like Series A VCs. And in fact, we're in that blur between, what used to be seed, or what used to be a Series A is now seed. So they've created pre-seed rounds to cover what used to be a seed round, right? And so the challenge of that is that generally, the bigger the fund, the more general they are. The smaller the fund, usually the more specialized they are. And the challenge of that is that if you're solving a problem, not driving a technology, you need the generalist fund. But they're really big, so they can't afford to put somebody on your board if you're only raising $1 million or 2 million or 5 million, when they want to do a $50 million round or a $150 million round. So you have to find a way to get there, to get big enough for the generalist guys, because there aren't as many generalists, unless you end up with 190 entities on your cap table or 400 entities. It becomes really quite a challenge.
Yeah. And so how did you learn all that, about the funding and, what was your past? Because I bet you didn't start like that before you were ever a founder.
No, you're as smart as the sum of your failures. And not necessarily always failures. Some of those lessons are just really, really, hard learned. I mean, my first venture capital backed semiconductor company was, like I said, in 97. Second one was in 2004. I saw the transition between 97 to 04. When I started Unaliwear in 2013, we were actually in another one of those transitions. So I went back to venture capitalists that, I'd made money for before, and I'm thinking, oh, slam dunk, they're going to fund us. And their funds were too big, right? So, when they first invested in us as a semiconductor play, they were investing out of $500 million, $500 million funds. And, we were doing $25 million rounds. Well, now I need 3 million. And they, at the time, were doing two $1.3 billion funds. And now they're doing $6 billion funds. So I don't know what their minimum investment has to be, but it's got to be hundreds of millions of dollars to afford to put a human on the board. So it's just a mismatch. We call that VC math, by the way.
Well, clearly a big gap. So does anybody want to reflect on that on the panel, or talk about something else that they find particularly conundrous?
So I was going to add to that, I think founders having to be a jack of all trades, know absolutely everything, is a really tough space to be, and having somebody there who they can bounce thoughts and ideas off, and who they feel comfortable with, who can say, look, you haven't really thought about this particular thing, is really important. And the other thing that I was thinking about is, how many of you know The Tipping Point? Malcolm Gladwell. He has a chapter on salesmen, mavericks, and connectors. Having someone who you consciously know is a connector in your circle is a really interesting thing to consider, because connectors, you can talk to them and they will figure out who to connect you to in their network that will help talk a problem through. And it kind of gets to what you were saying, Jean-Ann, where you said, I wrote down what my challenges were. When you can say things out loud and not be afraid to be the perfect CEO or the perfect person who knows how to do absolutely everything, things will come to you, but you have to say it out loud. And then if you have a connector, which is a super practical thing to do, that connector will go out and help find the people that you need. Just, it's in their DNA to operate that way. So if you can include a connector in, I think it can make a huge difference on advisors, mentors, challenges, technical issues, whatever.
Yeah, the problem is, though, how to find that right connector that's going to connect you to everything you need.
Well, you have to talk to people. You have to tell people that's what you're looking for. Be very conscious about it. Just say, I'm looking for somebody like this. And eventually, if you talk enough about it, someone will come forward out of that. I mean, I do think, like, I'm a big Springboard person. I've been with them for, probably, 10, 15 years in their early days. And I think that they're a wonderful way to get things going and started. And even if you don't use them as the, a platform for your startup, just the network of women that are in that group is really amazing. And that's a great place just to start.
Mhm. Well, thank you, Sheila. Carole, do you have a perspective on any of this, or maybe another gap that you'd like to mention that is particularly?
Yeah, so it's
hard for
interesting,
to
when you were asking Jean Ann, well, how did you figure this all out? I kind of had a little bit of an easier pathway. When my children were young, I decided to be a consultant and sort of work around their schedule. So I got to see good CEOs and bad CEOs and good companies and bad companies. I got to help raise money. So, sort of on the job training on all the different tool sets, because my ultimate goal was to run a company someday. So I had a little bit of an easier pathway, picking up a lot of the knowledge. And one of the things that I think probably, Rob, you see, when it's pretty easy to figure out in about 10 seconds whether a founder has done this before. Because I did the Mass Challenge Accelerator as well, and some of those first-time founders, and they just are lacking some pretty basic knowledge. So, what Jean Ann's comment about, if you're looking for an accelerator, they're all a little bit different, and they have, different strengths, different weaknesses, and so you have to really ask yourself, what do I need right now? And then, really go out and look for the accelerator that's going to meet your specific needs for where you're at in the moment.
Part of it, though, requires one, a level of self-awareness, and two, a humility, right? So you've got to be self-aware to know you don't know a particular area, you need help. And then you've got to have some level of humility to recognize and ask for help. And it's just, there's such a dichotomy here, because the people that are so successful, usually as CEOs, are just aggressive, and they're confident, and those are normally the people that are not the ones that have a humility or a self-awareness. And so I don't know how to solve that problem. That's a gap of a different kind. But does that make sense, Carole?
It does make sense. And then, there is a difference between sort of the traditional male role / founder / CEO, and then sort of the female founders. The statistics say that female founded companies have higher returns than the male counterparts. So I think there's some learning to be done. And the whole conversation about moving from stakeholder returns, right, to shareholder, where we're starting to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really trying to build companies that are not just 100% about, bringing in the bottom line. So I think I'm seeing a shift definitely in where that's going, and some of this does have its roots in the female founder experience and sort of what we're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
And I will say, I want to add one thing about the female founder experience, because this is a data piece that was absolutely critical to being able to get all of the funding that we did get for Unaliwear. And that is, you already know from the statistics, actually, last quarter, female founders got 1.6% of all venture capital. 1.6, yes. We just can't quite get over 2. And sometimes it's much less. So it's not shocking to anybody to find that female founders have a different experience in fundraising. What was super surprising to me, there was a study done by Columbia University Business School students. It was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2017, and we can post a link to that study. But it talks about gender issues in funding. And the interesting thing to me was, it doesn't matter the gender of the investor, only the gender of the entrepreneur. And the way that it shows up is in prevention questions versus promotion questions. So a prevention question is, how do you know that you have defined all of the risks? How are you going to handle your FDA risk? How are you going to handle your connections to the insurer risk? How are you going to, whatever, right? And the promotion question is, the classic Uber, how big is it going to get, right? And so just to give you an understanding of this issue. So in 2018, I pitched 328 venture capitalists to no for Unaliwear, 328, okay, in 1 year. I have never in 9 years gotten the how big is it gonna get question, except for from one VC, who's now a really, really good friend of mine. He's the only one who's ever said that. And of course, I flubbed it completely because I'm so used to turning prevention questions into promotion answers that it was like, I'm just not even used to thinking about how big it can get, because 60 million people in the United States above 65 and 1 billion worldwide. How big can it get?
So you're saying, Gina, that there are different, so the questions from investors are the same no matter what gender investors are, but founders get asked different questions. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. And the reason it was such an epiphany for me is because I was looking at the gender of the investor. And so I was pitching men like investors or like men, and I was pitching women as women. And I needed to be pitching them all as investors, right? Here's what you need. Here's the milestones. I know what I'm doing. Here's your return, right? Like Rob just said. And so when I made that change, a significant impact in our ability to raise funds from female-focused, angel groups and funds and things along those lines.
How fascinating. Sounds like we may have a topic for our next panel.
Can I ask Rob a question? Rob.
Yeah, so I just want to be mindful of the time. We have 6 minutes left in the panel. I do want to address some of the questions that were
are there questions? Okay.
Maybe last very quickly, Sheila. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask Rob what his thoughts were, because you fund companies. Any advice actually for these two women?
So I actually, and I'm going to probably be unpopular here, one of the companies that I've invested in is female-led. She's absolutely fantastic. She's had more success fundraising than any of my other CEOs. And she has avenues that the others don't have. There's groups of women that invest only in women-led companies. And she's presented to them and got more money than the other, so I think there are places, you just got to know where to go. She happens to be a good CEO. She tells a good story. She's got a great presence, but there are places you can go where men founders couldn't go and raise money. So just leverage all those spots. And there's a list of angel groups that only invest in female-led or founded companies. So part of it is just being educated on what's out there. So I'm keeping it short because I know Julia needs to get to her questions.
Thanks. And that's a wonderful way to close that gap. Yeah, I think the Ecosphere is starting to address it with funds for women that invest in female founders. But we have a long road to go, as we all know. But yes, this gap is being addressed, and maybe we'll have another panel just dedicated to that topic because it's a big one. Well, thank you, all the panelists. I'm gonna now engage the audience, I think, and go to the questions. So there were a few questions that, Rob, I think you kindly answered. So maybe, so one question, but I do want to make sure that the rest of the audience hears them. So one of the audience members, Rekha Kamath, has asked, thanks for the amazing panel and moderator. Given how connected our mind and bodies are, I see some great solutions for AI and data analytics-based mental health apps. Do you have any advice for fundraising in this space? So I see, Rob, that you have responded, but could you maybe go and respond to that question live for everybody?
Yes, I'm actually on the board of 2 different mental health companies. One is a nonprofit, one's a for-profit, and there's just so many. And actually a third one that I've been advising, and they have a VR headset that's very, very cool, that you can actually get a lesson where you're actually sitting on the beach and someone's talking to you, and it's a therapist. And so I have quite a lot of experience in the mental health space. There's just so many, and if you look at a competitive landscape, there's so many. So can you apply AI and data analytics to mental health apps? Absolutely sure you could. It's just such a busy space. You've got to just figure out how to position that story and that product within that space.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for that answer. And I think there's so much more that could be discussed. I think, in terms of the gaps and, trying to find mentors, and maybe there's AI solutions that could like match need to the resources. And I'm sure there are some out there, but they're not widely known. So I think that may be another interesting hook for follow-on topics that we could dive into next to be continued series. Just a thought. Well, anyway, I think we just have a couple of minutes left, and I want to thank the panelists for their fantastic presence and thoughtful answers, and helping our community brainstorm in that space, and starting the conversation with the Society of Decision Professionals in closing some of those gaps. And I'm going to turn it back to Eva for closing remarks.
Yes, so we're reaching the end of our presentation today. Thank you so much to our speakers, Jean Ann, Carole, Rob, and Sheila, and thank you to Julia for moderating our session today. And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's webinar. Again, I'd like to thank our presenters, especially our attendees, for their time and contributions to today's event. And I'd also like to remind you that you can find this webinar and all previous webinars in the Society of Decision Professionals member-only section of our website at decisionprofessionals.com. Thank you for being with us today, and you may now disconnect.